In this video, we will continue our examination of the scope of UCC Article 2 by looking at how Article 2 carves out certain types of transactions to exclude from its scope. Recall that Section 105 of Article 2 tells us that goods means all things that are movable, but it also tells us that some movable things are not considered goods, which brings us to excluded transactions. Certain things are excluded from the definition of goods. Certain things that might be considered movable are excluded from the scope of Article 2. Some of these exclusions are set forth in the statutory definition of goods. Specifically, the statutory definition says that goods means all things that are movable at the time of identification to the contract for sale, other than the money in which the price is to be paid, investment securities, and things in action. So, these things are excluded from the definition of goods and are therefore beyond the scope of Article 2. Let's take these one at a time. First, money in which the price is to be paid in any transaction. Even though the physical currency might be a movable thing, it is excluded from the definition of goods. Second, investment securities, a term that is not defined in Article 2, although it is defined in Article 8 of the UCC, but it is generally understood to mean certificates representing stocks or bonds. Even if the paper on which the certificate is printed is within the concept of a movable thing, the purchase and sale of stock or bonds is not covered by Article 2. Rather, it is covered by Article 8 instead. Finally, things in action is excluded from the definition of goods. Things in actions is another term that is not defined anywhere in the UCC, in Article 2 or elsewhere, which presents yet another issue of statutory interpretation for us. As we implied earlier, for an undefined term, most courts would rely on a dictionary definition, and for a legal term like things in action, perhaps a legal dictionary. And if you looked at a legal dictionary, it would say something like the following definition: that a thing in action is a legal right arising under a contract or otherwise to recover debt, money, or a thing. So, even if that legal right is reflected in or embodied in some physical document, which might be considered a movable thing, that legal right is not a good even though the paper it is printed on is a movable thing. So, money, investment securities, and things in action are not goods and are therefore excluded from the scope of UCC Article 2. Elsewhere in the code, specifically Section 107, we find that other types of transactions are not subject to Article 2. Note again, Section 107 is not cross-referenced by 105. 107 deals with things that may be movable but are in some way affixed to or attached to real property, and it provides another set of statutory exclusions. Under certain circumstances, transactions in certain movable things are not within the scope of Article 2. Let's start first with subsection 1 of Section 107, which reads that a contract for the sale of minerals or the like, including oil and gas, or a structure or its materials to be removed from realty, is a contract for the sale of goods within this article if they are to be severed by the seller. Note this provision does not explicitly address whether these things are goods if severed or extracted by the buyer rather than the seller. So this requires a bit of statutory construction. But the clear negative implication of this statutory language is that a sale of minerals, oil, or gas, or a structure attached to real property is excluded from the scope of Article 2 if the minerals, oil, gas, or structure are severed by the buyer rather than the seller. Subsection 2 of 107 provides one final set of exclusions from the scope of Article 2. This subsection reads that a contract for the sale apart from land of growing crops or other things attached to realty and capable of severance without material harm thereto, but not otherwise described in subsection 1, or of timber to be cut, is a contract for the sale of goods within this article, whether the subject matter is to be severed by the buyer or the seller. So this subsection is a bit different than subsection 1. It says that either party may sever crops, fixtures, or timber, but note again that it requires a bit of statutory construction, because the provision does not explicitly address whether Article 2 applies where removal of crops or fixtures from the seller's land would cause material harm to the land. But again, the clear negative implication is that if the removal of crops or fixtures from the seller's land would cause material harm to that land, then the transaction is beyond the scope of Article 2. It would be an excluded transaction. So, finally, after looking at 5 provisions of Article 2, namely sections 102, 105, 106, 107, and 501, we now know what kinds of transactions are governed by UCC Article 2. But still, we're not done yet with defining the scope of Article 2 because we still need to deal with the difficult problem of mixed or hybrid transactions, a topic that we will take up in the next video.